Welcome to Fluent Daily, the English listening channel for advanced learners at B2 and C1 level. Every episode features a rich, flowing conversation in natural English on a topic that is genuinely worth thinking about: history, psychology, science, philosophy, and more. There are no simplified sentences here, no slow speech, no vocabulary drills. Just real English spoken naturally on ideas that matter. This is Fluent Daily. Let's get into it.
Today we have a great story, so let's get started right now. September 26, 1983. I want you to imagine you are sitting in this secret fluorescent-lit bunker just outside of Moscow.
It's a terrifying place to be.
Right. And it's just past midnight. You're a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces, and your one job, literally your entire reason for being in that chair, is to monitor the early warning satellite system for any sign of an American missile launch.
And remember, the Cold War is at its absolute freezing point right now. I mean, paranoia is everywhere.
Exactly. Paranoia is through the roof. And suddenly, the alarms in the bunker just start screaming. A giant screen in front of you flashes the single word in bright red, which is LANCH.
Oh, man.
Yeah. The system is telling you with the absolute highest level of automated certainty that a nuclear missile is currently flying toward the Soviet Union. And then the system detects another one.
And another.
Right. And another. 5 in total. You have about 15 minutes before those missiles hit.
15 minutes to decide the fate of humanity.
Yeah, because your standing orders are to immediately report this to high command, which, will almost certainly trigger a massive civilization-ending retaliatory strike. Millions of people are asleep in their beds, completely unaware that they are minutes away from vaporizing, and you have to make a decision.
It's the ultimate nightmare scenario of the modern age. It's a single human being crushed under the weight of an existential choice. You're forced to decide the fate of the world in the time it takes most people to drink a cup of coffee.
It's wild. And today on this deep dive, we are pulling back the curtain on this completely invisible architecture of destruction because it's layered right over our heads every single minute of every single day.
Yeah, it didn't go away when the Cold War ended.
No, not at all. We've spent weeks poring over this massive stack of declassified military documents, theoretical physics papers, and historical archives. They detail the invention, the deployment, and the ongoing active threat of nuclear weapons.
And our mission today is really to figure out how we got to that bunker in 1983. And, well, more importantly, how we are still navigating this exact same knife edge today.
Because the terrifying reality, and you have to keep this in mind as we go through this, is that this architecture isn't a relic of history.
Not even close. I mean, we live in a world where approximately 12,500 nuclear warheads are sitting in silos on submarines and in bomber bays right now.
Which is just a staggering number.
It is. And around 2,000 of them are on high alert status, like quite literally ready to launch in minutes.
And we've just normalized this. We treat it as background noise.
We have to, psychologically. But to truly understand the geopolitical reality we inhabit, we have to look directly at the science, the terrifying near misses, and the deep, unresolved ethical fractures that brought us here.
Exactly. So by the end of this deep dive, you are going to understand the hidden mechanics of international security. You'll understand the physics that make a city-killing weapon possible and the psychological defense mechanisms we all use to cope with living under a perpetual sword of Damocles.
But to understand the terrifying scale of a modern nuclear arsenal, we really have to rewind. We have to go back to the early 20th century.
Right, to a moment when the idea of destroying an entire city with a single bomb was literally nothing more than numbers on a chalkboard. And it all starts with Albert Einstein in 1905 writing down E equals mc squared.
The most famous equation in human history.
Yeah, but I have to admit, I hear that equation all the time, and I barely grasp what it actually means in a physical sense. Like, what is it actually saying?
Well, its actual implication is often deeply misunderstood. Before Einstein, classical physics treated mass and energy as two completely separate things.
Like you have the object and you have the force moving the object.
Exactly. You had physical stuff, mass, and you had energy, which was the force that moved the stuff. What special relativity proposed was that mass and energy are the exact same thing, just in different states.
Wait, so mass is just energy?
Mass is essentially incredibly concentrated energy.
Right.
And the c in that equation stands for the speed of light, which is an enormous number. And it's squared, making it astronomically larger. So even a microscopic amount of mass, if you can figure out how to unlock it, contains an almost incomprehensible amount of latent energy.
Okay, so it's like discovering that every rock on the ground is actually a battery containing the energy of 1,000 thunderstorms, but we just don't have the cord to plug into it.
That is a fantastic way to look at it. The energy is bound up in the nucleus of the atom. Atoms have protons in their core, and protons are positively charged.
And positive charges repel each other, right? Like magnets.
Exactly. From everything we know about electromagnetism, positive charges fiercely repel each other. They want to fly apart, but they don't.
Why not?
Because they are held together by something called the strong nuclear force. It is immensely powerful, but it only works at microscopically short ranges. It is essentially nature's strongest superglue.
Okay, I'm following.
So if you can overcome that glue, if you can break that nucleus apart, all that binding energy is suddenly released. But for decades, physicists just had no idea how to crack it open. They needed a crowbar.
And that crowbar arrives in 1919 with Ernest Rutherford, right? When he achieves the first artificial nuclear transmutation.
Well, Rutherford proved the nucleus could be altered, yeah, but the real breakthrough tool, the actual crowbar, comes a bit later. In 1932, when James Chadwick discovers the neutron.
Ah, the neutron, because it doesn't have a charge?
Exactly, the neutron changes everything. Before 1932, if you tried to shoot a positively charged proton at an atomic nucleus to break it, the positive charge of the nucleus would just repel it away.
Like trying to push two magnetic north poles together.
Precisely. But a neutron has no electrical charge. It acts as the perfect invisible projectile. You can fire it directly into the heart of an atom, and it just sails right past the electrical defenses and strikes the nucleus.
Okay, wow. So that sets the stage for 1938. You have scientists all over Europe experimenting with this new tool. Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann are in Germany, and they start bombarding uranium, which is, really heavy, unstable element, with these newly discovered neutrons.
And uranium has a massive nucleus, making it a great target.
Right. And they notice that the uranium atoms aren't just chipping, they are splitting roughly in half, creating lighter elements. They had discovered nuclear fission. But reading the sources, they didn't fully comprehend the terrifying math of what they were seeing, did they?
Not initially, no. They observed the chemical results, but they really struggled with the physical mechanism. It took Lise Meitner, who was a brilliant physicist who had recently been forced to flee Nazi Germany, and her nephew Otto Frisch, to correctly interpret the data.
And what did they realize?
They realized that when that uranium nucleus splits, the repulsive electrical forces completely take over, and the two halves fly apart at immense speeds. That kinetic energy is the release of Einstein's E=mc².
The battery is unlocked.
Exactly. But Meitner and Frisch realized something else, something far more consequential.
The extra neutrons, right.
Yes. When a heavy nucleus like uranium splits, it doesn't just break into two pieces. It also spits out 2 or 3 extra neutrons in the process. And this is where the math turns apocalyptic.
Because they hit other atoms.
Right. If you have a dense enough lump of uranium, those 2 or 3 neutrons will fly outward and hit other uranium atoms, causing them to split, releasing more energy and spitting out more neutrons.
So it's an exponential curve. I mean, I always picture it like an empty room where the floor is completely covered in thousands of loaded mousetraps, and on top of every single mousetrap rest 2 ping pong balls.
Well, that's a good visual.
Right. If you toss just 1 ping pong ball into the room, it snaps a trap. That trap launches 2 balls into the air. They come down and hit 2 more traps, which launch 4 balls, then 8, then 16. Within a fraction of a second, the entire room is just an explosion of snapping metal and flying plastic.
The mousetrap analogy is brilliant because it perfectly illustrates the concept of a chain reaction. And in a nuclear chain reaction, those ping pong balls are traveling at a significant fraction of the speed of light.
That is terrifying.
The entire sequence, from one atom splitting to trillions of atoms splitting, happens in a millionth of a second. The moment Lise Meitner and Otto Frisch published their findings, the global physics community experienced this collective, terrifying epiphany.
Because they all knew what it meant.
Every physicist who read that paper instantly understood that a bomb of unimaginable world-ending power was theoretically possible.
And the timing of this discovery is just a cruel twist of history. I mean, it's late 1938, early 1939. Europe is standing on the absolute precipice of the Second World War. The Nazis are expanding.
The tension was incredible.
Yeah, and you have some of the greatest scientific minds of the century. Leo Szilard, Enrico Fermi, Niels Bohr, Edward Teller, and many of them are Jewish refugees who had narrowly escaped fascist Europe. And they are realizing that the regime they just fled might be the first to build this weapon.
The fear was palpable. Albert Einstein, spurred by Leo Szilard, famously wrote a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1939. He warned him that Nazi Germany might already be working on this exact concept.
And that letter changes everything.
It does. That fear, the sheer terror of a Hitler armed with an atomic bomb, is what initiated the most frantic, expensive, and secretive scientific endeavor in human history, the Manhattan Project.
Okay, let's talk about the sheer scale of the Manhattan Project, because reading the logistics of this endeavor in the sources is just mind-bending. They essentially built an entire top-secret Fortune 500 company overnight.
Driven purely by panic.
Totally. They employed over 130,000 people. They spent about $2 billion back then, which, I looked this up, is roughly equivalent to $30 billion in 2024.
That is a staggering amount of money for an unproven scientific theory.
Right, and they built entire secret cities. Oak Ridge in Tennessee, Hanford in Washington State, Los Alamos in the New Mexico desert. Hundreds of thousands of people working in these facilities had absolutely no idea what they were actually building. They were just turning dials and reading gauges.
The compartmentalization of information was unprecedented. Only a tiny fraction of the scientists at Los Alamos, under the direction of J. Robert Oppenheimer, actually grasped the full picture.
Because the folks at Oak Ridge and Hanford were just trying to get the fuel, right?
Exactly. The massive facilities at Oak Ridge and Hanford were dedicated to an incredibly tedious, monumental task, acquiring the fuel. Because, you can't just dig uranium out of the ground and put it in a bomb.
Why not?
Because natural uranium is almost entirely uranium-238, which doesn't fission easily. You need the rare isotope, uranium-235. And chemically, they are identical, so you can't just filter it.
Oh, wow. So how do you separate them?
You have to separate them based on a minuscule weight difference. Uranium-238 has 3 more neutrons than 235. That's it.
It took miles of pipes, enormous electromagnets, and huge amounts of electricity just to tease out this tiny percentage of the right uranium.
Right. It's a massive industrial effort.
But I want to ask about the engineering side of the bomb itself, because getting the material is one thing, but making it detonate is a completely different challenge. The scientists at Los Alamos were wrestling with this concept of critical mass. What does that actually mean in the context of building a weapon?
So critical mass is the exact amount of fissile material you need to sustain that ping-pong ball chain reaction. If your lump of uranium is too small, too many neutrons just fly out into empty space without hitting another nucleus, and the reaction fizzles out.
It just stops.
Right. So the simplest bomb design, the one they eventually dropped on Hiroshima, was called a gun-type device. You take a piece of uranium that is below critical mass, and you put it at one end of a literal cannon barrel.
Inside the bomb?
Inside the bomb, yes. You put another subcritical piece at the other end. You use conventional explosives to fire one piece into the other at immense speed. When they slam together, they form a critical mass, the chain reaction starts, and the bomb detonates.
That seems almost straightforward in a brute force kind of way. But they didn't just have uranium. They also manufactured a completely new artificial element at the Hanford site. Plutonium.
Right, which was a huge scientific achievement in itself.
But the documents show that you can't use that simple gun-type method for plutonium. Why not?
Plutonium is incredibly reactive. It undergoes spontaneous fission, meaning it's spitting out neutrons all on its own. If you tried to shoot 2 pieces of plutonium together in a gun barrel, they would start reacting before they fully met.
So they would blow themselves apart too early.
Exactly. They would melt and blow themselves apart prematurely in a small, dirty explosion. They called it a fizzle. To use plutonium, they had to invent an entirely new, incredibly difficult concept called implosion.
Implosion. So instead of shooting things together, you were crushing them.
Yes. You start with a solid, subcritical sphere of plutonium about the size of a grapefruit. You surround it completely with conventional explosives.
Okay.
The trick is you have to detonate those explosives so perfectly with such unimaginable microsecond precision that the blast wave travels inward, crushing the plutonium core.
Wait, it compresses solid metal?
It squeezes that grapefruit down to the size of a tennis ball. That extreme density brings the atoms so close together that a critical mass is achieved and the chain reaction goes off. It is like trying to squeeze a balloon perfectly in your hands so that it shrinks symmetrically without bulging out between your fingers.
And this engineering puzzle, this need to perfectly crush a sphere of plutonium, is what leads them to July 16th, 1945. The Trinity test in the Jornada del Muerto desert in New Mexico, they called the device the Gadget.
A very unassuming name for what it was.
Very. And nobody actually knew for absolute certain if the implosion lenses would work until they pushed the button.
The tension in those early morning hours was suffocating. I mean, Enrico Fermi was taking bets on whether the explosion would ignite the atmosphere and destroy the entire state of New Mexico, or perhaps the entire planet.
Which is an insane bet to make.
He was largely joking, but the fact that he could make the joke speaks to the terrifying frontier they were crossing. They really were in uncharted territory.
So the countdown reaches 0, and the physics works. The explosion yields the equivalent of 21,000 tons of TNT. The flash is so bright, it illuminates the surrounding mountains as if it were midday.
The sheer sensory overload of that moment broke the scientists' frame of reference. The heat on their faces, miles away from ground zero, the deafening roar of the shockwave.
It must have been awe-inspiring, but deeply horrifying.
It was. J. Robert Oppenheimer later recalled that a line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, ran through his mind. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds."
That quote is just, it's chilling.
Whether or not he uttered it aloud in the bunker is debated by historians, but it perfectly encapsulates the violent, irreversible pivot in human history. The greatest minds of a generation, driven by the noble desire to defeat fascism, had handed humanity the exact tools to end its own species.
And what's wild to me is that pivot from theory to horrific reality happens incredibly fast. I mean, Germany had already surrendered in May. The original fear that initiated the Manhattan Project was gone.
Right, Hitler was dead.
But the Pacific War was still raging, and the U.S. military now held this unparalleled weapon. Less than a month after Trinity, on the morning of August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay dropped a uranium gun-type bomb over the Japanese city of Hiroshima.
The bomb was detonated approximately 600 meters above the city. They used air bursts to maximize the destructive reach of the blast wave. The physics they had wrestled with for years in secret laboratories were suddenly unleashed on a civilian population.
I think we hear the name Hiroshima so often in history class that we lose the visceral horror of what actually occurred in that fraction of a second. So I want to pause and really look at this. Imagine standing in the center of your hometown. When the bomb detonates, the temperature at the hypocenter, the point directly below the blast, reaches over 1 million degrees Celsius.
Which is hotter than the surface of the sun.
Right. The thermal radiation, this intense flash of X-rays and ultraviolet light, expands outward at the speed of light. If you were standing within a mile of the hypocenter, the heat instantly carbonizes your flesh.
And the thermal pulse is followed immediately by the blast wave. The sudden, extreme heating of the air creates a wall of compressed air traveling faster than the speed of sound.
So it just flattens everything.
It hits with the force of a solid wall of concrete, flattening almost every structure, shattering every window, turning millions of pieces of wood and glass into supersonic shrapnel. Nothing survived within a 1-kilometer radius.
And then the firestorm begins. Because the thermal pulse has ignited everything combustible over a massive radius, the fires merge, sucking the oxygen out of the air, creating hurricane-force winds that draw more air into the inferno. Between 70,000 and 80,000 human beings are killed on the very first day.
And the suffering didn't end there. By the end of 1945, radiation sickness, acute burns, and injuries pushed the death toll in Hiroshima to around 140,000.
And 3 days later, August 9th, a plutonium implosion bomb is dropped on Nagasaki, killing another 70,000 people. On August 15th, Japan surrenders.
The deployment of those two weapons fundamentally altered the architecture of international relations forever. But it also birthed a profound, agonizing ethical debate that historians, ethicists, and military strategists are still locked in today.
It's a debate that feels impossible to resolve.
Because when we analyze the decision to drop the bombs, we see two entirely incompatible frameworks trying to make sense of the exact same event.
Right, and I really want to lay out both sides of this debate carefully, completely impartially, because depending on which framework you use, the morality flips completely. On one side, you have what we can call the strategic case, which relies heavily on utilitarianism, the idea that the most moral action is the one that minimizes overall suffering.
Yes. Historians like Paul Fussell argue that you have to look at the context of the Pacific War in the summer of 1945. The U.S. military was preparing for Operation Downfall, the massive amphibious invasion of the Japanese home islands.
And the projections for Operation Downfall were just horrific.
Right. The calculus was steeped in blood. The U.S. military had just fought horrific, grinding battles on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The Japanese military had demonstrated a fierce commitment to fighting to the last man, utilizing kamikaze tactics and mobilizing civilians.
So they expected heavy resistance.
American military planners projected that an invasion of the home islands would result in a staggering number of casualties. Estimates varied, but many anticipated anywhere from 250,000 to over 500,000 American casualties, alongside millions of Japanese military and civilian deaths. To this day, the U.S. military is still awarding Purple Heart medals that were minted in 1945 in anticipation of the invasion.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So the utilitarian argument is that Truman was looking at a ledger. On one side, the horrific annihilation of two cities. On the other side, millions of bodies on the beaches of Kyushu and Honshu. Under this framework, the bomb, despite its unimaginable cruelty, forced a sudden surrender and ultimately saved more lives than it took.
That is the core of the strategic case. It treats the use of the weapon as a tragic necessity dictated by the math of total war. But the dissenting case, championed by historians like Gar Alperovitz and Martin Sherwin, rejects both the utilitarian math and the historical framing entirely.
What's their main argument?
They operate on a deontological framework, an absolute moral standard that asserts certain actions are inherently wrong, regardless of their outcomes. The primary argument here is that deliberately targeting a civilian population center with a weapon of mass destruction is a war crime. Full stop.
Right, because you can't justify the intentional vaporization of children, doctors, and families as a coercive tactic, no matter how many military casualties you project.
Exactly. Furthermore, the dissenting case challenges the historical narrative that the bombs were the sole necessary catalyst for surrender.
Oh, because of the Soviets.
Right. Declassified intercepts of Japanese diplomatic cables reveal a government that was already seeking a negotiated peace, albeit with conditions regarding the emperor. Dissenting historians point to a massive, simultaneous shock that hit Tokyo, the entry of the Soviet Union into the Pacific War.
Because the Red Army invaded Manchuria precisely between the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Exactly. Many scholars argue it was the prospect of a Soviet invasion and the partitioning of Japan that truly broke the imperial war cabinet, meaning the atomic bombs were strategically unnecessary to end the war.
And this leads to perhaps the darkest historical suspicion of all. Was Hiroshima really the last act of World War II, or was it a demonstration? Was it the first move of the Cold War, designed to show Joseph Stalin that the United States had a monopoly on absolute destruction and the ruthless willingness to use it?
The documentary records suggest that policymakers were well aware of the diplomatic leverage the bomb provided against the Soviets. It was a complex, tangled web of motivations. But the crucial takeaway for us today is that this debate is not locked in a museum.
No, it's highly relevant right now.
The tension between the utilitarian calculus of total lives saved versus the absolute moral prohibition against targeting civilians is the exact same fault line that runs through modern military doctrines and international humanitarian law. We are still arguing using the vocabulary forged in the fires of August 1945.
And if intimidating the Soviet Union was a secondary goal, it had an immediate disastrous boomerang effect, because a monopoly on physics is impossible to maintain.
The laws of the universe are open to everyone.
Exactly. The secret was out, and the Soviets dedicated every resource they had to catching up.
Now, American intelligence agencies boldly predicted that it would take the shattered post-war Soviet economy at least a decade, perhaps longer, to develop a nuclear weapon. They fundamentally underestimated both Soviet scientific ingenuity and the extent of Soviet espionage within the Manhattan Project itself.
Klaus Fuchs, right?
Yeah, Fuchs and others passed crucial implosion data to the Soviets. So in August 1949, just 4 years after Trinity, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. It was practically a replica of the Fat Man plutonium device dropped on Nagasaki.
And just like that, the world fractures into a terrifying stalemate. The arms race begins, and the numbers quickly escalate from the realm of military strategy into the realm of sheer lunacy. I mean, we go from 2 bombs in 1945 to a peak global arsenal in the 1980s of roughly 70,000 nuclear weapons.
Unfathomable number.
70,000, with about 31,000 of them actively deployed on missiles, submarines, and bombers. And they weren't just making more of them, they were making them infinitely more powerful. This is when we move from the atomic bomb, the fission bomb, to the hydrogen bomb.
The thermonuclear weapon, or the hydrogen bomb, operates on an entirely different level of physics. Fission splits heavy atoms. Fusion forces light atoms, like isotopes of hydrogen, to combine.
Which is what the sun does, right?
Exactly. But to get hydrogen atoms to fuse on Earth, You need the temperatures and pressures found at the center of the sun. So a hydrogen bomb actually uses a traditional fission atomic bomb just as a spark plug.
Wait, the atomic bomb is just the trigger?
Yes, the atomic bomb detonates, creating a momentary environment of extreme X-ray heat and pressure that compresses the hydrogen fuel, triggering fusion. A fusion weapon can be hundreds, even thousands of times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima.
That is, I mean, the leap in destructive capability is just sickening. So if one side builds a bigger bomb, the other side builds a bigger bomb. If one side builds an intercontinental ballistic missile, an ICBM, the other side builds 10. To rationalize this spiral, military planners in Washington and Moscow developed a strategic doctrine with the most chilling, appropriate acronym in history. MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction.
Mutually assured destruction is the psychological and mathematical architecture that defined the Cold War, and in many ways still defines our security today. The fundamental premise of MAD is that nuclear war is deterred solely by the absolute certainty of annihilation.
Okay, let's unpack this.
So, if State A launches a first strike against State B must guarantee that enough of its weapons will survive that initial attack to launch a devastating, civilization-ending second strike against State A.
Meaning, whoever shoots first dies second. It is institutionalized suicide.
Precisely. To make this credible, both sides develop the nuclear triad. You don't just put all your missiles in land-based silos because those can be targeted in a first strike. You put bombs on long-range aircraft. And most importantly, you put ballistic missiles on nuclear-powered submarines that can hide deep in the oceans for months at a time.
Ah, so the subs are the ultimate insurance policy.
The submarines ensure your second strike capability. If the enemy vaporizes your cities and your silos, the submarines will rise from the deep and incinerate the enemy's cities in return.
Okay, I have to pause here because looking at this from a human perspective, I see a fatal flaw. MAD assumes that everyone involved, the presidents, the premiers, the radar operators, the submarine captains, will act perfectly rationally with perfect information 100% of the time.
Which is a very big assumption.
It stakes the survival of the human race on the idea that humans don't panic, that computers don't glitch, and that communication systems never fail. That seems like a massive psychological gamble.
It is the glaring weakness of game theory when applied to human beings. In a sterile, academic simulation, MAD is completely logical, but reality is messy, opaque, and driven by fear. The strategy assumes a level of flawless execution that is impossible to maintain over decades.
And we know it's impossible because we have the receipts. Declassified documents from the Cold War are basically a catalog of near apocalypses. We did not survive the Cold War because of the flawless logic of deterrence. We survived because we were incredibly lucky and because a few individuals decided to disobey their training. Which brings us to October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
It is universally recognized as the moment the world held its breath. The United States discovered that the Soviet Union was secretly deploying nuclear missiles on the island of Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida.
Right in our backyard.
Yes. President John F. Kennedy instituted a naval blockade of the island, demanding the missiles be removed. For 13 days, the two superpowers stared each other down. But what the public didn't know at the time, and what we only learned decades later through declassified archives, is that the crisis was dangerously close to going nuclear underwater.
I really want to paint the picture of this specific incident for you because it is terrifying. The focus is on a Soviet diesel-electric submarine, the B-59. It is operating deep in the Sargasso Sea near Cuba, and the conditions inside this sub are hellish. It was not built for the warm waters of the Caribbean.
It's built for the freezing Arctic.
Right. So the air conditioning has failed. The temperature inside the metal hull is pushing 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The crew is rationing water. Men are passing out from heat stroke and carbon dioxide buildup. And they are completely cut off from radio communication with Moscow. They have been submerged for days.
Above them, a flotilla of American destroyers and an aircraft carrier have detected their presence. The American ships begin dropping depth charges, small explosives designed to rattle the submarine and force it to surface so it can be identified. The Americans view this as a signaling tactic.
But the men inside the B-59 don't know there are practice charges. They're sitting in the dark, suffocating in 120-degree heat, and the hull is being hammered by explosions. The lights are shattering. To captain of the submarine, Valentin Savitsky, it seems obvious. World War III has already begun on the surface, and here's the detail that makes your blood run cold. The B-59 is armed with a nuclear torpedo with the explosive yield of the Hiroshima bomb.
And Captain Savitsky ordered the nuclear torpedo to be armed and readied for launch against the American aircraft carrier above them.
Oh my God.
The protocol for launching the nuclear weapon required the unanimous consent of the three most senior officers on board. Captain Savitsky wanted to fire. The political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, agreed to fire.
2 out of 3.
The third officer was the flotilla commander, Vasily Arkhipov. He was second in command of the submarine, but he held veto power. Despite the heat, the exhaustion, the explosions rocking the sub, and the intense pressure from his captain, Arkhipov said no.
He just refused.
He argued that they had no definitive orders from Moscow. He argued that the American depth charges were too small to be lethal and were likely a signal to surface. He insisted that they surface and await instructions, rather than starting a global holocaust on an assumption. He talked Savitsky down, they surfaced, the Americans backed off, and they sailed home.
If Arkhipov had caved to the panic, if he had just been a little more tired, they would have vaporized an American aircraft carrier. The U.S. military would have immediately retaliated with nuclear strikes against the Soviet Union. The Soviets would have launched their ICBMs. The entire northern hemisphere would have burned. You and I are literally having this conversation right now because one sweaty, exhausted man at the bottom of the ocean decided to break the momentum of a crisis.
It completely shatters the illusion of controlled deterrence. We have this retrospective comfort about the Cold War, you know? We tell ourselves deterrence work, but the documentary evidence proves it was often blind luck. And as you mentioned at the very beginning of this deep dive, Arkhipov wasn't the only one. Fast forward to 1983.
Right, the Able Archer incident.
The context of the early 80s is vital here. Ronald Reagan is president. He has dramatically increased military spending, deployed Pershing-II missiles in Europe, and publicly referred to the Soviet Union as the evil empire.
So the Soviets are already on edge.
Very much so. The Soviet leadership, aging and paranoid, genuinely believes the United States is preparing a preemptive nuclear first strike.
Which makes the events of November 1983 so dangerous. NATO conducts a massive, highly realistic command post exercise called Able Archer. They are simulating the escalation to nuclear conflict. But Soviet intelligence intercepts the communications and thinks this isn't a drill, they're using an exercise as cover for an actual attack. They place their nuclear forces on high alert.
The tension was incredibly thick. And it is in that exact geopolitical pressure cooker, just weeks before Able Archer, that Stanislav Petrov is sitting in that bunker outside Moscow. The scenario you described at the start.
Let's go back to that bunker. The alarm goes off. The system says 5 American ICBMs are inbound. Petrov's explicit training dictates he report this to his superiors immediately.
The Soviet early warning system, called OCO, was newly deployed. It relied on satellites detecting the infrared heat plumes of missile engines launching from the United States. The system was designed to strip away human hesitation. But Petrov looked at the data. He reasoned that if the United States were launching a preemptive first strike to wipe out the Soviet Union, they wouldn't launch 5 missiles.
Right, they'd launch thousands.
Exactly, they would launch thousands, attempting to overwhelm the defenses. 5 missiles made no tactical sense.
He had a gut feeling, a distinctly human intuition that a machine cannot possess.
He overrode the system. He reported it as a false alarm, risking his own career and potentially his life on a hunch. And he was correct. It was a remarkably specific computer glitch. The satellite had misidentified the sun's reflection off high-altitude clouds over North Dakota as missile launches.
Again, relying on an individual's instinct to override protocol saved us. But as we look at the broader sweep of this history, the international community eventually realized that depending on the sheer luck of having a Vasily Arkhipov or a Stanislav Petrov on duty is not a sustainable global security strategy.
Right, we couldn't just keep rolling the dice.
There had to be an attempt to put the genie back in the bottle, or at least stop the spread of the technology.
That realization culminated in the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT, which opened for signature in 1968. It is widely considered the cornerstone of the global nuclear non-proliferation regime. The NPT is essentially a grand bargain built on 3 main pillars.
Let's walk through this bargain. What did the countries actually agree to?
The first pillar applies to the 5 states that had already tested nuclear weapons by 1967. The United States, the Soviet Union, the UK, France, and China. These are the recognized nuclear weapon states. They commit to pursuing negotiations in good faith toward eventual complete nuclear disarmament.
Okay, the second pillar.
The second pillar applies to everyone else. The non-nuclear weapon states promise never to acquire or develop nuclear weapons.
And the third pillar?
The third pillar ensures the inalienable right of all states to develop and use nuclear technology for peaceful purposes, like medical isotopes and nuclear energy, provided they submit to rigorous inspections by the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, to ensure they aren't secretly diverting materials to build a bomb.
When we evaluate the NPT today, it feels like a treaty of massive contradictions. On one hand, you can call it a success because in the early 1960s, analysts were terrified. John F. Kennedy predicted that by the 1970s, there could be 15, 20, or even 25 nuclear-armed nations. Today, we only have 9. So the treaty clearly slowed the sprint.
It undeniably restricted horizontal proliferation.
But on the other hand, isn't the entire structure of the NPT inherently hypocritical? It's essentially the 5 original nuclear powers looking at the rest of the world and saying, do as we say, not as we do.
You've hit on the central agonizing flaw of the NPT. It baked a structural inequality into international law. It created a world of nuclear haves and have-nots. And the non-nuclear states have rightly pointed out for decades that the recognized 5 powers completely failed on that first pillar. They never disarmed.
No, they didn't.
While the arsenals have come down from the insane peaks of the Cold War, the U.S. and Russia still possess thousands of weapons and are spending billions modernizing them.
And that hypocrisy gives cover to the states that refused to sign the treaty or signed it and then walked away. Which brings us to the 9 states that actually have the weapons today. You have the original 5, but then you have India, Pakistan, and Israel. None of them signed the NPT, and they all developed nuclear arsenals to address their own regional security fears. And then you have North Korea.
North Korea is a particularly concerning case study in proliferation. They actually joined the NPT, used the access to peaceful technology to build up their infrastructure, and then legally withdrew from the treaty in 2003.
Which is just a huge loophole.
It is. Since then, they have conducted 6 increasingly powerful nuclear tests. Current estimates suggest they have an arsenal of 40 to 50 warheads, and they have successfully tested intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of reaching the continental United States.
And looking at our sources, analysts highlight that North Korea views its nuclear arsenal as the ultimate, non-negotiable guarantee of regime survival. They have watched what happens to autocrats who give up their WMD programs like Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, and they have decided they will never denuclearize.
Which creates a perpetually unstable flashpoint in East Asia. Add to that the ongoing tensions surrounding Iran's nuclear program. Following the collapse of the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, Iran has significantly increased its uranium enrichment levels.
And if they cross that threshold?
Right. While they do not currently have a weapon, the fear is that if Iran crosses that threshold, it could trigger a rapid cascade of proliferation across the Middle East, with nations like Saudi Arabia feeling compelled to follow suit.
What worries me the most is that the guardrails are falling off right as the roads are getting icier. The arms control architecture that the U.S. and Russia built over decades is unraveling. The INF Treaty, which banned an entire class of intermediate-range missiles, was abandoned in 2019.
And New START is in trouble, too.
Yes. The New START Treaty, the last remaining treaty limiting strategic deployed warheads between Washington and Moscow, is set to expire in 2026 with very little prospect of renewal. We're sleepwalking back into an unrestricted arms race, but this time it's a 3-way race between the U.S., Russia, and a rapidly expanding Chinese arsenal.
The contemporary risk environment is, in many ways, far more complex and dangerous than the Cold War. During the Cold War, it was a bipolar standoff. The rules of the game, terrifying as they were relatively understood between two capitals. Today, you have multiple nuclear-armed actors intertwined in regional conflicts.
This brings us to a crucial point, and it's something I want you, the listener, to really internalize. Because it's easy to look at a map and think, well, India and Pakistan are far away, or North Korea is far away. If deterrence fails over there, it's a tragedy, but it won't reach my living room.
That is a very common misconception.
But the sources completely dismantle that comfort, because a nuclear explosion is not just a localized event. The indirect environmental consequences are far more terrifying than the immediate blast. Let's talk about nuclear winter.
Deterrence theory and traditional military planning have historically focused almost exclusively on the direct effects of the weapons. The blast radius, the thermal heat, the ionizing radiation, they treat them like incredibly massive conventional bombs. But in 1983, a group of scientists, most famously Carl Sagan, published models detailing a secondary environmental effect that had been completely overlooked.
That's it.
Yes. When a nuclear weapon detonates over a modern city, It ignites plastics, asphalt, fuel reserves, and buildings simultaneously over a vast area. This creates a firestorm, much like what happened in Hiroshima, but on a massive scale.
And firestorms behave differently than normal fires.
Absolutely. A firestorm acts like a gigantic chimney, sucking in air and driving an incredibly powerful updraft. This updraft pumps millions of tons of dense, black, carbon-rich soot high into the atmosphere.
Now, if you have a massive forest fire, the smoke stays relatively low in the troposphere and eventually rain washes it out, right?
Correct. Weather occurs in the troposphere. But a nuclear firestorm is so energetic that it punches the soot right through the troposphere and up into the stratosphere.
Where there is no weather.
There is no weather in the stratosphere. It doesn't rain. So that soot just sits there. High-altitude winds rapidly spread it across the entire globe, wrapping the planet in a thick, dark shield.
And that shield absorbs sunlight. It prevents the sun's energy from reaching the surface of the Earth. The models showing a large-scale nuclear exchange between the U.S. and Russia are apocalyptic. The soot injection would block so much sunlight that global average temperatures would plummet by 8 to 10 degrees Celsius.
To put that in perspective, the last ice age was only about 5 degrees Celsius colder than today.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. A drop of 8 to 10 degrees would cause temperatures in the agricultural heartlands of North America, Europe, and Asia to drop below freezing in the middle of summer. It would mean the absolute failure of global agriculture.
Billions of people would starve to death.
The survivors of the initial blasts would emerge from their bunkers into a dark, freezing world with no ability to grow food. Yeah. The ecological collapse would be total.
But again, you might think the U.S. and Russia are careful. Let's look at the scenario modeled by climate scientists Brian Toon and Alan Robach regarding a limited regional nuclear war. Say, a conflict between India and Pakistan over Kashmir escalates. They each use 50 Hiroshima-sized weapons against each other's cities.
That's 100 small weapons, less than 1% of the global arsenal.
Right, less than 1%. But the climate models show that even this limited regional exchange would inject roughly 5 million tons of soot into the stratosphere.
And what does 5 million tons of soot do to the global climate?
It would cause a sudden global temperature drop of about 1 to 2 degrees Celsius.
That sounds deceptively mild. Oh, it's 1 degree cooler?
Right. It sounds mild until you look at the fragility of modern agriculture. A sudden 1 to 2 degree drop shortens growing seasons drastically. The models indicate it would reduce global agricultural yields of staple crops like wheat, rice, and corn by 20 to 50% for over a decade.
So, a localized war on the exact opposite side of the planet would literally empty the grocery stores in your neighborhood within months. It would cause a global famine that could potentially kill 1 billion or more people who had absolutely nothing to do with the conflict.
This is the grim ecological reality that undercuts the entire logic of a winnable nuclear war, or even the concept of localized deterrence. The weapons are globally suicidal. This profound understanding of the humanitarian and environmental catastrophe is what drives modern disarmament movements, notably the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN.
ICAN won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017 for their work pushing a new piece of international law, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW.
The TPNW represents a huge paradigm shift. It channels the frustration with the failure of the NPT's disarmament pillar. This treaty seeks to establish a categorical, absolute international norm.
It makes it illegal under international law to develop, test, produce, stockpile, or threaten to use nuclear weapons. It treats them exactly the same way the world treats chemical and biological weapons, as inherently abhorrent and strictly prohibited.
It entered into force in 2021, and 93 nations have signed it. But here is the massive, depressing caveat. Not a single nation that actually possesses nuclear weapons has signed it, nor has any nation that relies on the U.S. nuclear umbrella like NATO allies or Japan and South Korea. So what is the actual point of the treaty if the people with the bombs ignore it?
The goal of the TPNW isn't immediate magical disarmament. The goal is stigmatization. By establishing a clear legal prohibition, the treaty forces nuclear-armed states to constantly defend their arsenals on the global stage.
It puts them on the defensive.
Exactly. It delegitimizes the weapons, putting political and moral pressure on governments and financial institutions to divest from the companies that build these systems. It's a long-term strategy of normative pressure.
Which is desperately needed because the technology is not standing still. The risks today are arguably higher than when Stanislav Petrov was sitting in that bunker because the technological landscape has become infinitely more complicated. One huge factor analysts point to is the development of highly accurate, hypersonic conventional weapons.
This is deeply destabilizing. During the Cold War, if a satellite detected an incoming ICBM, you knew exactly what it was. It was a nuclear warhead. Today, nations possess long-range precision missiles that can carry either a conventional explosive warhead or a nuclear warhead, and the delivery vehicles look identical on radar.
This is the ambiguity problem. Imagine you are a military commander in a severe crisis. Your radar detects an incoming hypersonic missile aiming at one of your critical nuclear silos. You don't know if it has a conventional warhead designed to just smash the silo or a nuclear warhead designed to vaporize the entire region. You have minutes to decide. Do you wait for the missile to hit to find out?
Because if you wait and it's nuclear, you've lost your ability to retaliate.
Exactly. The pressure to launch your own nuclear weapons immediately, to use them or lose them, is overwhelming.
It compresses decision time to almost zero. And that compression of time leads us to perhaps the most terrifying contemporary development, the integration of artificial intelligence into military command and control systems.
This is a colossal paradox. We have just discussed how human intuition, the gut feelings of Arkhipov and Petrov, saved the world from computer glitches and false alarms. And now, militaries are looking at the blistering speed of modern warfare and thinking, humans are too slow. We need AI to process the sensor data and recommend responses.
It's terrifying.
We are considering plugging artificial intelligence, a technology famous for hallucinating facts, failing in unpredictable edge cases, and lacking any moral compass, into the architecture of human extinction.
The allure for military planners is undeniable. An AI can process millions of data points from satellites, drones, and radar in milliseconds, whereas a human would take hours. But in a severe nuclear crisis, the environment is unprecedented. It's an out-of-distribution event.
An AI can't handle that.
Right. An AI follows its training data and its algorithmic logic. If an AI had been sitting in Petrov's chair in 1983 processing those 5 false radar blips, it wouldn't have paused to consider the strategic illogicality of a 5-missile attack. It would have simply seen the data, matched the pattern, and triggered the escalation protocols.
It just acts on the input.
When you strip human hesitation, empathy, and fear out of the loop in favor of machine speed, you vastly increase the probability of accidental catastrophe.
It makes you wonder how the people who plan this for a living sleep at night. And that brings us to something that often gets overlooked, but is crucial for anyone trying to understand this topic, the language we use to talk about it. Over the last 80 years, the nuclear security establishment has developed a highly specific clinical vocabulary.
The lexicon of nuclear strategy is designed to be sterile. We use terms like deterrence, counterforce targeting, which means aiming at the enemy's military silos, and counter-value targeting, which is the incredibly sanitized term for aiming at cities and deliberately vaporizing millions of civilians. We talk about yields and delivery vehicles.
The euphemisms are wild. A missile carrying a hydrogen bomb is a delivery vehicle, like it's an Amazon truck. I've always found the term nuclear exchange staggering. Planners say, in the event of a limited nuclear exchange. We use the word exchange like we were talking about, returning a slightly damaged sweater at a department store, not the end of human civilization.
But there is a deep psychological utility to this language. If you are a strategic planner at U.S. Strategic Command, your daily job involves calculating blast radii, wind patterns for radioactive fallout, and casualty estimates in the tens of millions.
It's too much for a normal brain.
Exactly. If you maintain a deep, visceral, emotional connection to the reality of melting flesh, burning children, and suffocating cities every second of your workday, you will mentally collapse. The clinical language acts as a psychological shield. It allows planners to apply technical rationality to an inherently irrational scenario.
It protects them. But for the rest of us, for the public accepting that sanitized language is dangerous, we have to develop critical literacy. When a politician or a pundit casually talks about tactical nuclear strikes or escalation dominance, we cannot let the clinical words lull us into thinking this is just abstract jest. We have to constantly translate those terms back into the reality of firestorms and famine. We are talking about the survival of everything we know.
That critical literacy is the only way to generate the sustained political will required to actually change the trajectory. Because right now, the current environment of renewed great power competition gives every nuclear-armed state a built-in structural excuse to maintain and modernize their arsenals. The logic of deterrence creates a permanent hostage situation, and no one wants to be the first to put their gun down in a room full of armed, nervous adversaries.
So let's step back and look at the massive journey we've taken today. We started with Einstein's theoretical unlocking of the energy bound within the atom. We walked through the frantic, secretive, industrial miracle of the Manhattan Project, where scientists figured out how to squeeze a sphere of plutonium into a weapon of mass destruction.
And we confronted the horrific ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Right, and the agonizing, unresolved debate between utilitarian math and absolute moral limits. We examined the sheer, terrifying lunacy of mutually assured destruction and the heart-stopping near misses in submarines and bunkers where individual human disobedience saved the world.
We looked at the attempts to contain the technology with the NPT, the apocalyptic reality of nuclear winter blocking out the sun, and the modern heightened threats of AI and hypersonic missiles.
It is a vast, complex, and visible architecture of survival that we have constructed over 80 years. But as we look at this history, there is a fundamental assumption that we need to challenge. In international security, we often treat nuclear deterrence as a permanent state of balance. We assume it is a stable equilibrium, that because it has worked since 1945, it will work forever.
We think we have it under control.
Right.
But in any highly complex system, if you introduce enough time, enough actors, and enough near misses, failure goes from being a mere possibility to a mathematical certainty. If you flip a coin enough times, eventually, despite a long streak of heads, it will land on tails.
It has to.
The truly provocative question isn't just whether deterrence will eventually fail. Given enough time, the math suggests it must. The question is what failure will actually mean, and whether there will be anyone left to invent an entirely new vocabulary for the ashes of the aftermath.
That invisible architecture we walk under every day. It only has to fall once. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep looking up, keep paying close attention to the sanitized language being used around you, and as always, keep questioning the information you're given.